So welcome back to Red Reviews, or yeah, because I think I titled it Red Reviews, but then we like bantered a bit about what to call it.
Yeah, I like red reviews. That's cool. That's cool with me. I also like the pun potential there. So you've got red, and then you have I've read.
Yes, that's right.
The red reviews is great. That's perfect. And so tonight is, I think I said in the first episode where we talked about Kim Stanley Robinson that like sometimes these reviews will be fun and they'll be good about books that are good, and sometimes they're going to be about books that are bad. Well, this is a bad one. So tonight we're covering Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, which I don't have a hard copy of anymore.
Okay.
I sold mine back. I periodically I take stuff to Half Price Books, which is a local store here. Well, it's a chain, but there's like a local location there, and I sell my stuff back and I get other things. Some books I keep because I like them, and some books I get rid of because I'm like, I read it, I'm good, or I didn't like it, or whatever. So tonight I'll be working mostly based off of my my essay that I wrote about it, which so for those who don't know, Daniel Dennett is part of what is called the Four Horsemen of Atheism.
Right.
So he was a part of what has been sort of deemed the new atheist movement, which I don't think they ever explicitly used, but it was used about them and sort of used to describe them. So this is Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett, right?
Yeah.
And what kind of
Dennett's the good one, right? Like he's supposed to be the good one.
He's supposed to be the good one. And I would say compared to like someone like Dawkins, who is an open transphobe, or Harris, who is an out and out racist, and Hitchens, who ended up becoming an imperialist toady for power.
He is the good one.
He kind of is the good one. And Breaking the Spell kind of reads that way. It's not nearly as confrontational or condescending, although there is a lot of that in there.
Of course.
So what really inspired this was the book turned 15 years old this year. It was published in 2006. And it's a book very much of its time. What really caused the new atheism to become a thing, beyond just all these guys who are all writing books all at the same time? And go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think everybody kind of assumed it was 9/11 kind of brought about the moment, right?
Yeah. I think in my essay, I make the argument that it's not just that, it's two things. So it's that, which is certainly, I think, a huge part of it. And then the other component of it is what they called the evolution wars, which was sort of in the early 2000s, where you had this sort of resurgence, the evolution wars plus the sort of the ascendancy of Christian conservatism in American politics, particularly like the presidency of George W. Bush. And those, I think, were very big influences on the new atheists. Ironically, though, I think the one that stuck more was 9/11, because they have this like singular focus on Islam, like a fetish. And and so what I sort of make an argument of in my essay is I say that while Dennett's book is certainly more charitable to religion than, say, the other ones, it's nevertheless, it has all of the usual hallmarks of the sort of new atheism, which is incredible condescension, intolerance, arrogance, scientism, which is sort of the idea that the physical sciences are the only real knowledge that exists, and they're the things that are going to get us out of our problems. So it's kind of devoid of politics. It's devoid of history. It's devoid of sociology or anthropology.
It avoids like good philosophy.
Yeah, pretty much. It's just and ultimately it's kind of hollow, which is kind of what I make an argument of. And so when I sort of tackled the book, my first thing was sort of looking at, well, what did people say about it before? So there were a few reviewers that I went through and sort of read their reviews. So Leon Wesseltier, who wrote for the New York Times, himself not immune from controversy. I mean, he was Me Too'd, I think 3 or 4 years ago now, for being an out and out creep, which is true. But I still went and read his review because it was kind of iconic at the time. And And it has all the same kind of problems that I had with the book, which is, the scientism, the arrogance, the sort of narrow-minded thinking. But basically, a lot of the reviews weren't particularly kind to it, mainly just because some of the book's central claims are either just factually wrong in the sense that they're just not true, or they're inane to the point of not even being relevant. So the thing that's really important about thinking about the book is that in my essay, I sort of go through and I explain what are four of his big concepts.
Okay.
And the first one is that he's sort of breaking the spell, and we'll get into what that means. Like, breaking the spell is so revolutionary. It's not. That religions are memes, which I think is the most controversial part of the book, which is also wrong. Belief in belief, which I think is the most interesting part of his book, and I think probably partially right.
Okay.
And then what we should do with religion, the sort of to use Lenin's phrase, what is to be done, right? What is to be done?
Okay.
And so essentially what I say is, Breaking the Spell isn't a bad book, but it isn't much of a good book either. And so so let's sort of break these down. And before I get into that, basically what inspired me to read this book was I had it on my shelf for years. It was one of the first books I ever bought when I started working at Books A Million in 2009. And that was like peak of my, new atheist asshole phase. So and so I had read The End of Faith. I had read Letter to a Christian Nation. I had both by Sam Harris. I had read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and I had read God Is Not Great. The only one I had never read was this one. Okay. And I was sort of like a completionist, which I don't know if that makes me admirable or glutton for punishment. I really don't know. But so let's start with his first claim, which is that what he's trying to do is that what we need to do as a society is break the spell of studying religion scientifically. This is like one of his big claims he makes in the book.
Okay.
He basically says that, let me see, let me try to find a quote of his where he kind of makes this point. Let's see. Here's what he says. So it is high time that we subject religion as a global phenomenon to the most intensive multidisciplinary research we can muster, calling on the best minds on the planet. Why? Because religion is too important for us to remain ignorant about. It affects not just our social, political, and economic conflicts, but the very meanings we find in our lives. For many people, probably a majority of the people on Earth, nothing matters more than religion. For this very reason, it is imperative that we learn as much as we can about it. That, in a nutshell, is the argument of the book. Now, here's the thing. That's not necessarily a bad idea. Like, that's not wrong. But there's no taboo about that.
No, that's right.
And so why is it such a taboo? And I basically make an argument going back I'm not even talking about ancient philosophy or history. I'm just saying going back at least to the Enlightenment, to the 18th century. If we go back at least to the 18th century, there are philosophers and writers who are already doing this.
Yeah.
And two of them he actually quotes in the book. One of them is David Hume. The Scottish philosopher who wrote dialogues concerning natural religion. He talks about a natural history of religions. So there's Hume. And then in the 19th century, it's William James. In the early 20th century, it's the Varieties of Religious Experience, which is his large psychological and anthropological study of religion. And I basically lay out a point of saying that, like, there are numerous scholars who've done exactly what he's saying we need to do, the kind of spell we need to break. Right. It's not really taboo to study religion scientifically, or at the very least with reasonably, right? Like a rational discussion about religion. Yeah. So I literally lay out like a whole list. So there's Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason, Immanuel Kant's with Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, Robert Ingersoll, this guy right here, who I wrote my entire master's thesis on. He wrote 12 volumes, which are right above me, mostly critical of religion, using science and history to debunk it, including his most important Some Mistakes of Moses, which is his criticism of the Pentateuch. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in The German Ideology. Ulrich Marx, his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he comes up with the phrase, religion is the opium of people. Lenin, I've written about Lenin, socialism and religion. I have a whole essay on that. Sigmund Freud, totem and taboo. Taboo is literally in the fucking name. And then basically, additionally, scientific researchers such as Pascal Boyer, Andrew Newberg, and Scott Atran have all done research into religion, which Dennett references in the book. So his central thesis is pointless. It's pointless.
Yeah.
Like, what the reason that he's doing this is because what he really wants is when he says breaking the spell, what he really means is we need to just study religion with evolutionary biology and basically yell at people and tell them that all religions are viruses of the mind, which is what he believes and which is what Dawkins believes, which is bullshit. And we'll get into why that's bullshit. But that's the first central problem with his whole book, is that it's not like studying religion scientifically or reasonably is a good thing to do. And I don't think that's a problem. But to say that there's like some kind of spell over people that just precludes them from studying religion is just not true. You're only really talking about a very narrow subset of people who are religious fundamentalists who are not comfortable with it. Because there are swaths of religious people who are either very comfortable with science and they're very uncomfortable with having their own individual religious beliefs, which they put in one place. And in the other place, they discuss like the roots of religion in terms of evolutionary biology or sociology or history, right? He's only really bitching about fundamentalists, which is funny because he's kind of a fundamentalist in himself because he basically clings to a theory that's a dead theory that's been long dead. And that's the subject of memes. But before we get into that, I figured I'd pause. And if you have any like further questions.
No, I think you pretty much covered everything that I could have thought of. Like you say, it seems obvious that people have been studying religion and it's not like some big thing that, you know, nobody's allowed to look at it. Like, but that was a big talking point in the new atheism thing for a long time, is that we're doing something that nobody is allowed to do. We're against the grain, right?
Which is so funny. And that's the point that I try to drive home in my review, which is that like he is a tenured professor at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, Tufts University, where he runs a department on cognitive science. The book is published by a major publisher, which is Viking, which is Penguin. Yeah. Now Penguin Random House, because they merged. And it was on the fucking New York Times bestseller lists. So there's like, and all of the new atheist books were like this. Yeah. So I think what they did was they hit the zeitgeist of the time, which is why this book feels very dated. Right. Is that people yearned to find some kind of reason to sort of justify their atheism, which is fine. Like, I think if you're young, like when I was young, because I think I read The God Delusion when I was like 19. I think I read God's Great when I was like 19, 20, 21. Like, I get it, right? Like, I can understand a young person reading those books and getting something out of them. I understand. For sure. But they're kind of elementary. And the big problem I have with Dennett is that, like I said earlier, when he's not making points that are just so obvious, like breaking the spell, like it's fucking obvious. Like, people have been doing this forever, and your book isn't that revolutionary. It's one of many books that have done this topic. In fact, your book was one of two that came out that fucking year, because 6 months later, The God Delusion came out. Right. And he fucking quotes the end of faith in the book. So it's like, dude, like, you're not as revolutionary as you think. No. Like, you're not that radical, you know? So that's really the huge problem. The second problem with the book is that everything boils down to fucking memes. And we'll get into what that means. Okay. So I'm going to preface this with saying memes do exist, okay? In the sense that they're like funny graphics with like grammatically tortured phrases and funny images. Like, those are real. Those actually exist, and they actually go around and are popular, right? Those are real, you know? Yeah. I don't have any problem with I Can Has Cheeseburger. That's not what I'm attacking here. Right. What I'm attacking is what Dennett believes, which is taking the meme concept way farther than it was ever intended to go. In that memes exist in the sort of anthropological, natural sense. That memes are essentially the cultural counterpart of genes. And genes do exist, right? Like they're very much real. They make up who we are. But Dennett's claim is that not only are there memes, not only are there genes, they're actually memes that exist in the wild, that are real, tangible things that go from people to people, and they kind of have a life of their own. This is not true. It's fundamentally not true. And the problem with what he calls them culturally based replicators. So he sort of sees them as being like having a life of their own. So it's like languages, fads, songs, and even religions are memes, according to his conceptualization. This essentially is counter to another biologist, one I actually really like, named David Sloan Wilson, who's written a much better book on this subject called Darwin's Cathedral, where he talks about the concept of group selection. Okay. And in the eyes of people like Dennett, because what you're going to learn throughout my review tonight is that Dennett is basically Dawkins's bitch. So like anything that Dawkins believes, Dennett also believes and will fight to the end for it. Right. And so, which is why I think it's also instructive to see recently, and I do want to make this point because this is relevant, that the American Humanist Association recently just revoked Richard Dawkins' 1996 Humanist of the Year Award for his racist and transphobic comments.
Yeah.
And true to fucking form, because, like I said, Daniel Dennett is to Richard Dawkins like Lindsey Graham was to John McCain, in that he comes out on Twitter and defends Dawkins.
Of course.
So, and trying to like, you know, hem and haw and like, let's look context, whatever. So, but anyway, so that's what religions are. But group selection is a phenomenon in biology where basically the unit of natural selection is not necessarily the individual species, but it's actually a group within that species, right?
Right.
This is something that Wilson has written about. This is something the late Stephen Jay Gould proposed, Richard Lewontin, a bunch of other folks have written about this. For people like Dawkins, who's more of a sort of neo-Darwinian, the object of selection is either the individual or actually it's the gene. And
right.
And so they don't think that group selection is true. I think that it's controversial, but in general, I think the group selection is true. And I think here a good case for how religion was an adaptation based on group selection. Darwin's Cathedral by David Sloan Wilson is a good exposition on that.
Okay.
So, so what is it like? So basically my problem with memes is that Dennett grants them a power that I don't think they have. So like, what does it mean for a meme to benefit? Like, how does a meme benefit? Because so for example, like religions sometimes can be harmful, but then people believe them anyway. So does that make them beneficial? I mean, that's the problem. So like the whole because the whole thing that Dennett goes throughout the book is he uses the question cui bono, which is Latin for who benefits. And he talks about how religion is sort of a meme that benefited human societies that sort of grew over time. Now, the problem with that is like, I think some of that's true. Like, I do think that the development of religions within humanity did actually, I do think on a sort of anthropological, historical, evolutionary level really did elevate us, right? Because it's earlier versions of science or history or understanding helped us learn how to conceptualize things, how to do a bunch of, so like some of that's true, but the idea that it's like memes that sort of bore into people's minds and have lives of their own is just not true.
Right.
Think about any time anybody wants something to go viral and they intentionally do it and then it doesn't. So it's like, it's all up to caprice, right? Because humans are making the choices. So like,
groups of humans are really unpredictable in what they will attach to and what they like. I mean, sometimes I think of a real world example is that the people who started like QAnon, there was multiple instances of anonymous accounts claiming to be insiders in the government over and over and over and over again over the years. And then one finally took hold, right? Like it wasn't like they could manipulate this idea and, you know, make it go viral and make it into a movement. It had to be, you know, within the culture and like all these other things, all these other influences had to be part of it.
Yeah. And I think the problem that Dennett has when you're thinking about his concept of memes is that he sort of, and this is something I just sort of thought about now and I didn't put it in my essay, but it's something I think it's important, is that he often like instead of thinking of things as being sort of random, which I think certain things that catch on, who the hell knows why they do, because they just kind of do, doesn't necessarily mean that they have a certain level of determination, or like there's a certain agency to it. It just means like some things catch on, some things don't, and it's kind of up to chance. And again, like the bigger ontological problem, to use a big fancy word about like the nature of being in philosophy, like on a pure ontological level, you can't prove that not that you can't prove that memes exist, but that up to this point, people have not been able to actually like have any evidence to suggest that they exist.
Right.
And it's
it's almost a non-falsifiable claim.
Yes.
Which in any other instance, even Dennett would reject.
Yeah. Which is kind of funny, which is why I said earlier that he's kind of a fundamentalist, because he still believes in this shit well after people stop thinking of it as being a serious scientific concept. There's only two major scholars who still talk about the concept of memes on that level. One of them is Daniel Dennett, and the other one is Susan Blackmore. That's it. Nobody else does. And there's a reason for that, which is because the science was bad. So I basically went through and did a lot of research from, there's a really great journal called Perspectives in Science, which is published by MIT. And they published a couple essays that I read that are really instructive for understanding the meme part. The first one was by Radim Chavaha, who's from the Levnia Laboratory for the Experimental Research of Religion at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. And he wrote a 2020 comparative study basically looking at two major themes about cultural evolution that have caught on over time. One of them was memetics, which was Dennett, and the other one is called gene culture coevolution, or GCCE.
Okay.
And long story short, GCCE is the one that actually has scientific evidence to support that it's real, and memetics does not.
Okay.
and most scholars in the field accept GCCE and they reject memetics. And then this is a note that I make too. One interesting note that I found both interesting and hilarious was that in 2004, 2 years before this very book was published, Breaking the Spell, the Journal of Memetics, the premier journal in the field, folded. It ended. And the reason why, in its final issue, its editor, Bruce Edmonds, said that they admitted that the science of memes lost the competition with other evolutionary accounts. So
it's just, like you say, it's just not evidence, supported by evidence.
Yeah. And yet Dennett still clings to it, right? And so if it's complete nonsense, how did this catch on? And this is where I think it's instructive to be a leftist. Because what do we do as leftists? We look at the material forces of society and how they shape culture.
Right.
If you want to know why memes caught on, you have to understand the context in which they came up, which is that they were originally written about in the early, like in the conception that Dennett created in the early 1980s and really caught on in the 90s. Well, what's going on in the 80s and 90s? It's neoliberalism. It's Reagan, Thatcher, Clinton, it's Blair. It's the atomization of society. It's treating everyone as selfish individuals, right? The head of Enron literally called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins his favorite book.
Right, yeah.
So it's really important to understand that that's the context in which this stuff builds up. It's an ideological justification for the ways in which individualism has superseded any concept of communal understanding or collective understanding in our culture.
Right.
And that's why memes caught on. The other important part, and there was an article that I read also in Perspectives in Science, published in 2012, by a science historian named Jeremy Berman. And what he laid out, and the short answer is that the concept of memes that Richard Dawkins originally came up with in The Selfish Gene was never, ever intended to be something that became a real science. It was a narrative device for him to describe to people the object of selection being the gene. And he used the meme concept that he came up with as a metaphor. Memes are a metaphor. That's what they are. Yeah. And that's fine. If you use memes as a metaphor, that's fine. But they're not a real thing. Like, not in science. They're not a real thing. So how did they become a real thing? Well, it had a lot to do with Daniel Dennett. In 1981, he and another mathematician he and a mathematician named Douglas Hofstadter published a book together called The Mind's Eye, which was a collection of philosophical essays. In it, they published an essay by Richard Dawkins on memes where he formulates, I'm going to put that in quotes, the science of memes. Now, what's instructive about this? The way that they got the chapter that Dawkins wrote, quote unquote, was they actually took sections from The Selfish Gene and other parts of his works, and they basically mashed them up together and moved them around to create this Frankenstein's monster of science writing to justify what they thought.
Interesting.
And so they deliberately misled people about what memes are and made a whole science based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Richard Dawkins, or a fundamental I'm trying to figure out, like, deliberate misrepresentation of his work. So that's awful. Right. When I figured this out, I realized, like, Dennett is a hack piece of shit who
that's no good.
Who will basically warp what people have written to justify what he believes, which is hilarious considering the subject of his book, which is religion. He basically created a religion, a scientific religion. And it was all in sort of tortured amalgamations of language from Dawkins that had very little to do with any empirical evidence.
Wow.
And so that just drove me insane. I know we're getting close to the 30-minute mark, but basically there's so much wrong with this book. But basically, memes are not nonsense. They're not real, and you shouldn't. And Dennett's whole entire, like, philosophical project's built on them, which means that a lot of his work is just nonsense. I mean, in general, it just is, you know? So I'll try to cover the next couple of things briefly. So, like, belief and belief, I think, is the only So belief and belief is the only part of the book that I think is worth anything. I think it's kind of an idea that is interesting, which is this idea that people don't believe in religion so much. They don't believe in God so much as they believe in the belief of God, meaning that, like, people believe that belief is in and of itself a virtue. There's something to be said about that, which I think some of that's true. The big problem with that whole concept, even though I think it's great, is that basically you have to become a mind reader to figure out what people actually believe and don't believe.
Right.
So when he says they don't really believe, they believe in belief, he doesn't actually empirically know that. Like, he just doesn't. Right. That's an opinion of his based on people's perceptions. Now, we can say that, and in my article, I even make a point of saying, like, sometimes you can figure out if someone's believing in belief, whether they're bullshitters, right? Like, it's like a politician or, like, you know, some evangelist or whatever, you know. But anyway, like, it's something you can empirically prove, but it's an interesting concept in and of itself. So that's, I think, the most interesting thing. And essentially, I make the point of saying that, like, there's nothing about dedicating yourself to a belief system that makes you a better person. Just because you're a religious person or not doesn't make you a good person. You can be terrible and be religious. You can be terrible and not religious. And I basically make the argument that I think this world would be a lot better off if we judge people more on their actions than their intentions or justifications. So it's kind of just saying, like, you know, we need to pay attention a lot less to what people say and look at what they actually do, which is what I think we as leftists do, right? When we hear some claptrap from the U.S. State Department or the CIA about us democratizing, we're spreading democracy, right? Or, like, you know, we know that's bullshit, right? Like, we know they're not telling the truth. There's a fundamental difference between what they say and what they do. And I think that's a good thing to believe. I think that's a good point.
Yep.
The last thing I'll mention is he sort of talks about what we should do with religion, like what we should do. And I think the most egregious thing that he makes a point of is he comes up with this idea of that we need to develop, like, a department. He basically says, you know how we have, like, a Department of Health and Human Services in the United States, like a Department of Health, physical health. He's like, well, we should develop a Department of Cultural Health. And my first thought was, like, what the fuck do you mean by that? Essentially, there's a lot of problem. I mean, who gets to say, you know, he basically says we need to develop a Department of Cultural Health that can inoculate people against bad ideas, right? And, you know, who gets to decide what we need inoculation from? Government bureaucrats or democratic systems of knowledge? How will the inoculation happen? By classrooms or concentration camps? I mean, treating ideas as scourges that need to be eradicated recalls all the horrifying excesses of the 20th century, from Nazism to Stalinism. This concept of cultural health is undemocratic, anti-human, and shouldn't be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll leave you with is basically that despite how quote unquote nice he is, there are times in the book where he can't help but be a smug prick. So there's this point, there's literally like within the first 50 pages of the book, he basically pleads with his reader, please read me. Like, please read the ideas I'm trying to get across.
Okay.
Please hear me out. Give me a fair shot. Right. And he's saying this in the context to religious fundamentalists specifically.
Okay.
He's talking to them. He's talking to people who are religious who might take umbrage with some of the ideas that he has.
Right.
The problem is that he says, like, give him an open mind on page 53. But 2 pages earlier, he says this. History gives us many examples of large crowds of deluded people egging one another on down the primrose path to perdition. How can you be so sure you're not part of such a group? I, for one, am not in awe of your faith. I'm appalled by your arrogance, by your unreasonable certainty that you have all the answers. I wonder if any believers in the end times will have the intellectual honesty and courage to read this book through. It's really hard to ask readers to have an open mind when mere paragraphs ago you fucking insult them. Yeah. Like, now look, like as secular people, maybe we agree with a part of what he's saying there. Right. But you have to understand the context in which he's writing that, which is that he's asking people to give him an open mind. Well, he then proceeds to be a smug prick about people's religious beliefs. It's like, you can't do that, man. Like, if you want people to actually listen to you, you can't insult them. And he does this throughout the book, which I find absolutely ridiculous. And I'll just leave it with my last sentence of my essay, which is that Breaking the Spell, if it's remembered at all, will be remembered as one book among many others that tried to explain religion away and ultimately failed. And that's it. It's a shitty book. It's a polemic that is parading itself around as a serious scientific investigation of religion. Now, I have no problem with polemics. I love them, right? And the one thing I will say about people like Sam Harris, Dawkins, or Hitchens in their books is at least they're a little bit more intellectually honest than this one is, in that they are polemics. They make no bones about it, right? They are angry, full-throated, polemical books. This one tries to parade itself around as being like this sort of like objective understanding of religion when it's just as polemical as the other ones. Right. And so it's a crappy book. You shouldn't read it. Don't waste your time with the new atheists.
One star, half a star.
So it's 2 stars.
2 stars.
2. Okay. Because I think it's well written. It is very well written. When he covers good science in it, he covers it well. He doesn't misrepresent it. And it was readable. Like, I could read it. I didn't hate reading it other than the bad ideas in it. So I'll give it 2. It's not, it's not end of faith bad, in that it's not overtly racist. Although there's some like white man's burden shit at the end of the book that I didn't get into tonight. But it's just not very good. And I think for those on the left who are skeptical of religion, who are secularists, obviously you are because you're listening to this, or you're interested in it, right? There are much more interesting people to read to get a sense of what these guys are trying to get through. So there's somebody like Martin Haglund, who's a philosopher who's written a book called This Life, which is about secular humanism and democratic socialism. 2 of my heroes are people like Corliss Lamont and Eric Fromm, 2 Marxists, humanists, who were critical of religion, but then also had a materialist socialist view of the world, right? So there's lots of cool writers out there who do what Dennett's doing far better and far more interestingly. So 2 stars. Don't waste your time with it. The new atheists are trash. And if you're interested in just sort of learning more about the phenomenon, I think there's an essay by Luke Savage at Jacobin called New Atheism, Same Old Empire, where he basically goes through and lays out how these guys are mostly just justifying the status quo and that they're imperialist tools. So good stuff. I know I went a little long, but there's a lot of ground to cover. Right. And
that's perfect. Thank you so much for this week's this episode's book review. Do we know what we're covering next time?
Not yet. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do. Maybe I'm trying to think. Oh, actually, yes. I know what we'll do next time. Okay. Next time, we're going to be covering a book that is a socialist critique of the media, but it's not the one you think. We're going to be covering Inventing Reality, The Politics of the Mass Media by Michael Parenti.
Okay.
which came out 2 years before manufacturing consent, which most people know about.
Yeah, almost
which
everybody
is also a
knows
book in and of itself. Yeah. But we're going to be covering Inventing Reality by Michael Prenny. That'll be the one we'll do next time.
Awesome. So where can people find your content?
Sure. So if you're interested in reading more of my anti-Dennett screed, you can go to justinclark.org. My full essay is called Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell 15 Years On. I have a bunch of other essays up there as well. And then if you're in the States, I highly recommend you get involved in DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. I'm the political education co-chair for Central Indiana DSA. So if you're in the Indiana area, hit me up if you're interested in learning more. And yeah, I always say, and I encourage people to read however you can. So if you like reading a paper book, you like reading an ebook, you like audiobooks, however you are going to read, always read, because reading is one of the most important things you can do. And in fact, I would argue it's probably one of the most revolutionary acts you can do. So read, and but don't read this crap that we talked about.
Just don't
read my essay on it. There's my shameless plug.
There you go. Right on. Thanks.
Thank you.